Alrighty, let's get set up to record. Who could be calling at this hour?
James, you just watched Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1.
I did.
As a critic, you must now review the movie and face hundreds of comments like, your opinion is stupid, or you're a shill.
I'm not a shill.
If you don't, the world will end.
Wow.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it...
I accept. I've seen this movie before. I accept.
Please hold.
Please hold. What? Hold music? Ethan Hunt never gets hold music. What? What's going on, everyone? James here with another real review, and that's right, today I'm giving you all of my spoiler-free thoughts on Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. A huge thank you to Paramount Pictures for giving me the chance to watch this in theaters. I went to my local AMC and saw it in Dolby Cinema. Trust me, the sound quality makes a huge difference in this movie, but you can check it out in theaters when it drops this weekend on July 12th. And when you do, gotta let me know in the comments what you think of the movie, if you agree with my review or not as well, because I have some thoughts. Dead Reckoning Part 1 is directed by Christopher McQuarrie, who's also directed Mission Impossible Fallout. And the film stars, yes, Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt, Ving Rhames is back as Luther, Simon Pegg returns as Benji, Rebecca Ferguson as Ilsa Faust, Hayley Atwell as Grace, and Klementieff as Paris. Hayley Atwell and Klementieff are two new additions to the franchise, among many others, but we will definitely get into that in my review because I gotta talk about some standout performances, and we gotta talk about this action, y'all, because it's amazing. So before I get into that, if it is your first time here at the channel, welcome to Real James, where I love talking about movies, TV, and all the news in between. So if you do too, hit the big red button below, subscribe to the channel, and tap on that bell. Y'all hit the thumbs up button if you like what you're hearing and what you're seeing, and get loud again in the comments and let me know, y'all, where does this movie rank for you? Is Dead Reckoning Part 1 your number one? I'm curious. Now, if you don't know much about this movie, let's get into it just a little bit. Ethan Hunt and his IMF team in this film must track down a dangerous weapon called the Entity, an AI that's hell-bent on destroying the world before it falls into the wrong hands. Now, that might sound simple, but in the film, they start to add layers to this story and the characters involved. One of the many things I actually liked about this movie. So you know what? Let's get into my positives before I even get into what I thought didn't work in this movie. And it begins with this, you guys. I do think that the impact made here with the new additions to the franchise just adds so much flavor to this film. And there are two absolute standouts for me. Let's begin talking about Hayley Atwell as Grace. She's no stranger to an espionage role, but here, she's not necessarily a spy right out of the gate. Instead, she's a legit pickpocketer, thief, and she sells all of her stuff, I'm guessing, on the black market. Every time I look at Hayley Atwell, I always think of her performance in the Marvel television show Agent Carter. I love that show. It's still one of the best Marvel television shows to date, including all the MCU Disney Plus shows, but she's really good in this role in Mission Impossible because I think she just fits into the mold very easily. She's got snappy line delivery, she's funny without even trying to be funny, and she works very well alongside Tom Cruise. Both of them start, well, on this cat and mouse game that never really ends until about, like, I think 30, 40, 45 minutes maybe into the movie. It's actually really impressive. It might even go on longer than that, but I love how they have this little game between them, and both of them actually have really good on-screen chemistry, so it only helps when they're really in the middle of a big action sequence. They can kind of go back and forth really easily, and Hayley Atwell on her own, she can hold her own water here. She's really great in this movie, but she's not alone. The second standout for me is someone who blew me away in this movie. I'm not gonna lie, I know I already tweeted about her performance, but Klementieff as Paris, she's working with the bad guys in this movie, of course. It's just an incredible performance, and notably because she doesn't say anything until about 60 minutes into the movie. Yeah, you heard me right. She has no lines of dialogue until an hour into the movie, yet she commands so much attention and perfectly fits into the fold of these action sequences that aren't necessarily big in scale, but the hand-to-hand combat scenes with Tom Cruise just work so well because of Klementieff. she has this screen presence about her, and she always kind of did, especially when she got introduced in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 as Mantis. I always thought she was really good in the humor department, but on the dramatic front, she's able to deliver some gut-wrenching scenes. There's a moment with her and Tom Cruise in the third act that got me in my feels a bit, and I'm like, hold on, is Paris my favorite character in this movie? Because the way she was able to convey all this emotion without saying too much, right? She does get more lines in the third act. It just really helped make a case for why she is one of the better, more consistent actors on the rise here in Hollywood, because, man, she crushes it here in this movie. I also think she'll be a fan favorite for most people after the credits roll, and another performance that'll probably get on the radar of many Mission Impossible fans is Esai Morales as Gabriel, who's another newcomer to the franchise. If I'm wrong and maybe he was introduced in like the first Mission Impossible, let me know, but I rewatched all the films before 7 and I don't remember seeing him at all, but he does play Gabriel, who's our main antagonist that we can see in human form. And that's because the overarching villain in this movie is an AI that we don't really see. Now, I have more thoughts on that, of course, as we get into this review, but I will say that Esai Morales' performance was a little back and forth. It's not terrible, don't get me wrong, but I think the pros outweigh the cons. My cons really are that sometimes his line delivery is a little too stoic and maybe a little wooden. That's partly the fault of the acting, but also of the writing. And I will say the character of Gabriel, I don't think is written very well into the story. Feels a little like we've seen this before. However, with that in mind, I still got upset, anxious, and I felt something towards this character because of the character's actions and the acting itself. And I think that's a win if you're looking at acting. If it makes you feel something, if it elicits a response that it was supposed to within the context of the film, then I think it's a win. So for the most part, Esai Morales does a really decent job, I would say. It's good enough because it makes me intrigued about what he'll deliver in part 2. And of course, we gotta talk about our leading man here, the action star himself, Tom Cruise, who is responsible for making these movies so darn excellent. I mean, Ethan Hunt as a character is really dynamic, at least he has been since Mission Impossible 3, but this might be my favorite portrayal of Ethan Hunt since Mission Impossible 3. Yes, I'm one of those fans who loves Mission Impossible 3, because there was so much emotion added to Ethan Hunt as a character. You know, Tom Cruise is always capable of delivering dynamic and performances that really kind of use his acting abilities in the best way. He has range, don't get me wrong. And here, this movie sort of gives us a softer side. Dead Reckoning Part 1 is a little bit lighter in tone at times than the other Mission Impossible films, and that's because of Ethan Hunt. He is more willing to display that selfless, soft side to him. There's a line here that actually made me smile pretty wide, and it made me a bigger fan of Ethan Hunt as a character. He says, "I can promise you that I will always care about your life more than my own." That is who Ethan Hunt is in this era of the Mission Impossible franchise. Every film, I would say, since 3 has given us a different hint as to who Ethan Hunt is at his core, and here in Dead Reckoning Part 1, I believe it's fully realized. Now, it wouldn't be a Mission Impossible movie without some incredible, big, larger-than-life action set pieces, and in Dead Reckoning Part 1, it's no exception. It was incredible. I mean, there are multiple moments where I found myself totally immersed in the action, and I feel like right out of the gate they established that tone of what to expect, because this movie is a decently long film. It's like 2 hours and 20 something minutes, so it's a longer movie than some of the other entries we've gotten, but gosh, there's so many notable action sequences. I'll just list a couple here. We got the car chase in Rome between Hayley Atwell and Tom Cruise, including Klementieff trailing not too far behind. It was incredibly well choreographed, and I felt all of that anxiety, I guess, with the chase happening, thanks to, of course, seeing it in a Dolby Cinema theater. And then another action set piece was basically the entire third act. Seriously, there were so many different moments here. You have the dirt bike cliff jump sequence that we've seen in the trailers and on posters, but in the context of the movie and the story, that stunt is even cooler. And then there's this, I don't even know how they filmed it, there's this long train sequence where you get Gabriel and you get Ethan Hunt fighting on top of a train, in the train, jumping from car to car, and I'm like, yo, what is happening here? How are they filming this? How much of this is practical? And shout out to the VFX department, because I didn't notice too much of a green screen at all, if they even used one, which I'm sure they had to. If not, Tom Cruise's insurance premiums must be through the roof. But like I mentioned earlier, Dead Reckoning Part 1 does something really cool, which is bring it down to a ground level when it comes to the action. All of the hand-to-hand combat scenes were very well done, and that is of course due in large part, again, to Pom Klementieff as Paris. They get the most out of her, and I love the work that she does alongside Ilsa Faust, played by Rebecca Ferguson, who did very well in this movie too. I just kind of wish Rebecca Ferguson got a little bit more screen time, and that's all I'll say about that. Trust me. But in my years of watching and critiquing film, I've noticed that even the coolest ideas sometimes can be ruined by terribly filmed action scenes, and I have to give huge props to cinematographer Fraser Taggart, who was also the cinematographer, or will be the cinematographer, for Dead Reckoning Part 2. It's his first major blockbuster film, and I could track all the action perfectly. Everything was framed very well. I love, how everything looked. It's not necessarily as dark and brooding as Mission Impossible 3. And it does have, I would say, lighter tones to it, so it does match what the dialogue is in this movie, which has got a lot more levity to it. But I did feel like I was suffocating in some scenes, especially in the second half of the movie. There were multiple times where I thought, I'm getting a little hot, and the theater was super cold. So I think that's due in large part, again, to the cinematographer here. And the cinematography, it's not the greatest I've ever seen, but it's good enough, and it only helped these action scenes feel more immersive. So at this rate, you're probably thinking, my goodness, this movie is exactly what I wanted it to be, right? Well, for me, I will say there are some glaring drawbacks and negatives that we do have to talk about, and it begins with this. I think that in Dead Reckoning Part 1, this is the weakest script that we've gotten since Mission Impossible 2. Okay, I know, Mission Impossible 2 is an awful film, okay? I know. I gave it like a 1.5 out of 5, I think, on Letterboxd, but I won't say this is on the level of Mission Impossible 2, but it is the weakest script that we've gotten, which speaks volumes to all the movies in between. The dialogue is pretty wooden here, okay? And I don't know why there's such a weird departure from the overt serious tones that we got in the previous installments. I think it has to do in large part to Christopher McQuarrie not writing the script by himself. Instead, he co-wrote it with Eric Jendrison, and I think Eric has some screenwriting credits for Band of Brothers, an HBO miniseries that is pretty serious. So I thought, alright, we're coming into this, it's gonna feel very grounded. But at times, I do think that the dialogue didn't really know where it wanted to go, and the tones of the movie were kind of clashing a bit. I didn't mind it too much. However, it didn't necessarily do a good job at establishing maybe whether it wanted to be more serious or just more funny. It tried to do both, and at times it felt ill-timed and out of place. And I also thought the writing was a little too on the nose, especially when it comes to the villain, the AI, and what people are using AI for. And I will be completely honest with y'all, they do not do some actors in this movie a great deal of service, including Carrie Elwes, I hope I pronounced that properly, who plays an executive director within the National Security Intelligence Committee, whatever the name is, the proper name is for that here in the US. But I don't know. Anyone else could have been in that role. They just gave him so much generic dialogue, and that's the problem I have here too, is that outside of our core group, I don't think the writing was very strong, and it's very noticeable. And when it comes to the actual pacing of the film, I don't feel Dead Reckoning Part 1 was as breezy as it could have and should have been. The movie, again, is clocking in at almost 2.5 hours. However, with Fallout, for example, I never felt that runtime, and we were over 2 hours in that movie as well. But here, in Dead Reckoning Part 1, I will say, after the first 20 minutes, the movie sort of settles down, and I don't necessarily feel like I was as into it. That I was checking my watch a couple times, and I thought, man, the movie's not really going anywhere right now, and I don't know, maybe it'll sit better with me on a rewatch, but it was that weird in-between moment with the first and second acts where the film sort of drags its feet. The pacing here is definitely more jumbled than in the previous films, but I think that's also the burden of having a two-part film. It feels like a relatively undercooked story at times, and I think that's on purpose because they cannot reveal everything in the first part of a two-part finale of sorts, right? So you have to wonder how much of that was just restraint so that part 2 can be excellent. And that's my hope, of course, because there were seeds that were planted in part 1 that, if of course executed properly, could make part 2 an all-timer. And this next negative might make some fans of our legacy characters in this franchise a little disappointed. Benji and Luther, I love those characters so much, and I'm not really going to comment on what they do in the movie because we're staying away from spoilers, but for the most part, Simon Pegg and Ving Rhames are largely sidelined in this movie. At times, I even forgot they were in the film, and that's because there are large stretches of the movie where we focus solely on Hayley Atwell and Tom Cruise together, and rarely anyone else. And I will say it kind of pays off in that second half, but I'm still disappointed because I do love both of those characters a lot, and sometimes I felt, okay, you know, Benji and Luther could have made a difference in these scenes. When we saw what Ving Rhames did with Michelle Monaghan in Fallout, and that moment between both of them was so sweet and endearing, largely because of Ving Rhames. So we needed a little bit more time with them, I think, and that would have helped push this movie over the edge just a little bit more. Okay, now I want to talk about the antagonist here, which is a little bit of a hit and miss area for me, at least here in part 1. I do love on the surface the idea of an AI villain because artificial intelligence is pretty much everywhere in the news right now. We got ChatGPT, we got, I don't know, all these Google's AI service. It's kind of a lot right now, and I'm not gonna lie, it's a little scary, especially in lieu of the writer's strike, and they're trying to fight against AI writing scripts. So this is a little bit of a timely film, especially in today's climate, but that's cool, right? That's a cool idea. I just don't think the way it was executed was perfect. I mean, there were some instances where I thought this is just okay. All right, this feels like a little bit of a filler villain when it should feel like the stakes are felt a lot more than they were. So at times I do feel like the impact wasn't there for me. I'm curious to see what the audiences will feel about this, but you have to imagine they're going to pick up the slack in part 2. Okay, my last negative, and then we'll get on to my final thoughts, you guys. The action here is great, like we just talked about, but it's the music that's lacking. And that is weird for me to say, because Lorne Balfe is an awesome composer, but the score, his score in this movie, is just non-existent for the most part. I mean, do I like his previous scores in this franchise? Absolutely. But in Dead Reckoning Part 1, it just kind of felt like it was there and didn't really do much for me. It didn't really aid action scenes, and that's also kind of a problem because there were some moments where I knew what I was seeing was awesome, but what I was hearing wasn't. So with all of that being said, both my positives and in my negatives, here are my final thoughts, you guys. Overall, Dead Reckoning Part 1 has truly grown on me since I watched it last week. I think this is the kind of film it's going to be for many audiences. You get out and you think, ooh, coming off the high of Fallout, this is not as great as Fallout. And you know what? I think adjusting your expectations is probably necessary because it is a one of two-part finale, right? So it's only one half of this story. And I will say, the positives, for the most part, outweigh the negatives. There are so many high moments here, right? You have the wonderful additions of Hayley Atwell and Klementieff. Tom Cruise is as consistent as ever. There's big action set pieces, and I love what they did in the third act of this film. It really hits the ground, and it makes a lot of noise in the best way possible. It got me excited for part 2, and I think that's exactly what it should have done. A lot of movies this year have gone to the third act and they've fallen apart, but Dead Reckoning Part 1 is not one of them. However, for all of the highs, there are some lows that are a little too noticeable. Is it as good as Mission Impossible Fallout? No, I don't think so. The lows are felt more here than in previous films, and it does render itself a bit less impactful again because it's only telling one half of a story. So it's tough to judge, right? But for the most part, this movie is more than just okay. It's really solid. And at the time of recording, I'm giving it a 4-star out of 5. That's the kind of movie I think it is. And it ranks in the mid-tier of the Mission Impossible franchise. I currently have it behind Fallout, of course, behind Mission Impossible 3. I know you guys might hate me for that. And I have it behind Ghost Protocol. But I do love what they did here in setting up for Part 2 because, like I mentioned, Part 2 has the potential and the ceiling is high for it to be an all-time great Mission Impossible movie and an excellent spy thriller. So there's a lot of potential here, and that's the thing. I believe they're cashing in all their chips with Part 2, and I can't wait to see what they do next year. Well, that's of course if it doesn't get delayed. But y'all, again, thank you so much for watching because that was my review, guys. Wow, we're done. Whoever called me and told me I needed to review that film, I saved the world, didn't I? No, I didn't save the world. There's only one that can save the world, my savior. But guys, let me know down below in the comments as I hit my microphone in excitement what you think of this movie. Get loud down below and let me know, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? And where does this movie rank for you in the Mission Impossible franchise? And of course, hit the big red button below and subscribe to the channel. We're closer than ever to 20,000 subscribers, and it's due in large part to you and your support. And y'all, again, thanks so much for watching because this was a lot of fun to put together and talk about, and now I have an itch to go watch the movie again. But I'm bringing my inhaler this time. Seriously, I got anxious. Alrighty, y'all. Again, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you at the next screening.